All right. Welcome to part two of the Domestic Violence and Homelessness 101 Victim Service Provider Training. And again, this is brought to you by the Safe Housing Alliance, Technical Assistance, and this is presented to the Three-County Continuum of Care, or COC, in Western Massachusetts. Thank you for coming back and joining us. Hopefully you were able to review part one. And this part two will get more into policies. We'll talk about the agenda a bit, but I'd like to reintroduce myself. My name is Charlena Powell. I'm the Director of Safe Housing, Survivor, and Equity Initiatives at the Safe Housing Alliance. My pronouns are she, her, and I identify as African American woman of color. I identify also as Hispanic or Venezuelan descent. Today, I have my hair pinned up in a bun. I also am wearing a white and pink scarf and top. I don't have my reading glasses on right now, but I usually have reading glasses when looking at the computer. I identify myself as a technical assistance provider and also as a person with lived experience in topics we are discussing today. So welcome back, and please stay with us until the end to talk about more topics on domestic violence and homelessness. Now, here are our learning objectives for today. In part two, we'll be talking about housing policy provisions and housing rights protections. We'll be talking into more historical aspects like the battered women's shelter movement. And we're also going to be talking about the shift towards housing solutions. We're moving towards solutions and addressing all those barriers and impacts we discussed in part one. And we're also going to talk about enhancing partnerships, the real allegiance towards partnerships in domestic violence and homeless response services, and how that can really play a role where you are in your sites. And we're going to talk a little bit about our vulnerability assessment that we're unpacking right now, our danger assessment, and we're calling it the Community Crisis Assessment Tool, or the CCAT. We're going to talk about the characteristics of how we're really trying to incorporate some of those aspects that survivors face into prioritizing their housing needs. And lastly, we'll talk about considerations for mental health services in survivor communities. And if you need more information on any of these topics specifically, and also how healthcare is a part of these solutions, we are open to discussing later on any types of details or addressing any questions or concerns. Please feel free to respond in the chat or comment down below any things that come up during our session today. And thank you so much for being with us. These are our objectives. So we're going into evolving advocacy responses to survivor housing needs. So here are some things we're going to address. When it comes to policy, we're talking about the federal housing protections, or an overview of sorts, for the Federal Fair Housing Act, or the FHA, the Violence Against Women's Act, or VAWA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or Section 504, also known as 504, and the Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So all of these provisions are things that you can really find. You can find it on the on HUD's website, or you can consult with technical assistance to really find out a little bit more. We're going to do a general overview of these things today. Now, for our battered women's movement, battered women's shelter movement, dating back from the 1970s and the 1980s. So this was established in the late 1970s by survivors as a response to the violence happening behind closed doors. So there was really like an underground movement, and the movement grew into a large and strong network of shelters across the United States, and with that, increased funding and legal protections for survivors. So those partnerships were banded together to really incorporate a movement, which then helped bring down some more funding from the federal government to address these protections. And there's a more multidimensional and intersectional understanding of domestic violence and sexual violence that is forming and that has formed throughout the 70s and 80s. And along with the understanding that DV and SV impacts a broad range of survivors and responses and require nuanced approaches. So really, of this movement, there's became certain niches that really became exposed to the barriers of violence and those historical oppressions. And there's different approaches that need to be considered. And this led to the passage of the federal housing protections for survivors, and is used as testimony to the focused efforts of the movement over the last 40 years. Now let's talk about the Federal Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act. This act helps to protect domestic violence survivors from discrimination in housing situations, regardless of whether the housing is supported financially by the government. I have a link here for the HUD guidance on the Fair Housing Act. And if you look on HUD's website, it talks about what is the Fair Housing Act, its definition, who is protected. And I really wanted to highlight the Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in housing because of race, color, national origin, religion, sex, including gender identity and sexual orientation, familial status, and disability. And really, the Fair Housing Act covers most housing. And if you take a look on their website, it has a list of different things in considerations, and also has resources on housing discrimination, fair housing and related laws, and how to file a complaint. Having this handy can really help with housing navigation practices, and if you see something, how to really file a complaint with HUD. Some cities have localized complaint systems, but you want to really be equipped with all the knowledge at your fingertips. So here's some survivor rights under the federal under the FHA. Freedom from discrimination when seeking housing to buy or rent, so buy a home or have to pay rents. There's also survivor rights for protections from eviction, being treated the same as other tenants or occupants by a housing provider. So let's say, for example, a survivor has a EHV or an emergency housing voucher, and someone that lives on a upper floor, they use their own income to pay their rent. These two tenants should be treated equally and having access to equal amounts of amenities and things of that nature. They occupy the space. So really being treated the same, those are parts of survivor rights. Or even there have been instances where certain, if you have certain vouchers or have a certain type of housing, you might have different doors that you would walk into. Like everyone in the main population would walk through the front door, but other populations who are paying a lesser amount of rent are walking through the side door or the back door. There are protections against this, and it's really important to make a complaint when you see these types of things in your neighborhood. That's just one example. And also really requesting reasonable accommodations to ensure that someone with a disability has equal opportunity to use and enjoy housing. So that means having access to get into the apartment, having access to a ramp or stairs or some type of mode of transport to going about different places in the apartment and in the building, and really having those things equipped so to keep survivors safe and also to address the needs of those who are experiencing difficulties or having any sorts of disabilities. Okay, and the Violence Against Women's Act, VAWA. Everyone always talks about VAWA and VAWA rights, and we're going to talk a little bit about that here. So the Violence Against Women Act provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking who are applying for or living in federally funded housing. So if the housing is accepting federal funds like HUD funds, for that the property owner is accepting that, the tenants are eligible. They all have access to VAWA rights. This applies to a survivor, actual or perceived survivors, regardless of sex, gender, identity, sexual orientation, disability, or age. We briefed over that from the HUD's website. And this was adopted in 2005, and it later expanded in 2013, the Violence Against Women's Act. This also does not apply to market rate rental housing unless there is a voucher or federally subsidized, and this includes COCs, continuums of care. And a little bit more about the reauthorization of VAWA, which was very recent under the Biden-Harris administration. Let's look a little bit deeper on that. If you go into the Department of Justice's website or DOJ, it talks about those reauthorizations that happened in 2013 and 2022. And there is one thing I wanted to highlight is the VAWA Reauthorization Act of 2013 included a historic provision that recognized the inherent authority of participating tribes to exercise special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction over certain defendants, regardless of their Indian or non-Indian status, who commit acts of domestic violence or dating violence or violate certain protection orders in Indian country. This is very new. This is as of 2022. So that's really a lot of special considerations are happening. And in this page, you can find out a little bit more, and also a reminder that there's now more funding for these tribal nations in the HUD DV NOFO. Okay, So here are some survivor rights under VAWA. Survivors cannot be denied admission, be evicted, or have their assistance terminated because of the violence committed against them. That's unlawful. And survivors must get a notice of housing rights under VAWA when they secure the housing. Survivors can also request that an abuser be removed from the lease and housing where it's applicable. So if the survivor comes into the property owner and says, I would like to have this person removed from my household, they are protected under VAWA. So it is survivors' right, and they really have to be knowledgeable in order to enforce this should there be some type of dispute as to who is, who has to stay and who has to leave. Also, survivors with housing choice vouchers or Section 8 assistance can move with continued assistance. So if survivor wants to leave and they live in a place that that is recognized under VAWA, it is up to the property owner to move them to another unit, or they can take their voucher and leave and go to another unit that accepts the housing choice voucher. Now, the policies can differ from state to state, but there's housing navigators that can really assist with the movement of a voucher to another unit. They are eligible. And also survivors have a right to seek an emergency transfer to another unit in the same program and or to a unit under another federally subsidized housing program. Now, an emergency transfer, it may take time to secure. That's why we want to encourage survivors to file for these things quickly and keep their documentation and really have a level of accountability towards what you're going to expect to happen and what's realistic. When you're talking to your survivor populations, set up a plan when it comes to emergency transfers on things to consider along this journey, and things to goal planning with the survivor on setting them up for long-term housing where they choose to go. And survivors also have the right to stay in the unit, even if there is or has been criminal activity that is directly related to the violence. So again, with the nuisance orders, we want to also offer options. It might not be the best option to leave. Maybe the survivor wants to stay. Maybe there are supports in the community that they're used to, or children's schools that they'd like to keep them in. So there might be flexible funding options to have survivors stay. So if you might need help with rental arrears or some types of flexible funding to stay, we want to support that and try to address all options, whether they want to stay or they want to move. And those are their rights. And also, survivors have the right to strict confidentiality of information. So consider when you're communicating with a survivor, the mode of communication. Is it through phone? Is it through text, email, snail mail or postal mail? Really protecting their information and how you communicate with other agencies, being particular to gender identity, and really asking them if they are comfortable with with their housing methods and their navigation processes, and just staying in that level of trust and communication. And also survivors can self-certify with using HUD self-certification form. So they can self-attest to their abuse. They do not always have to go to a method of a police, filing a police report. And if there is a conflicting information, a provider may ask for additional documentation. So there is a HUD self-attestation form that you can find online, and we can also provide that link as well for survivors to self-attest and then therefore be seeking their own housing resources. Going to the police might not always be the best route for a survivor when it comes to, securing their own level of safety and support. Now, here are some of the programs covered by VAWA. And really the overarching HUD programs include public housing or PHA's public housing authorities, Section 8 vouchers, again, the emergency housing voucher. This also includes project-based Section 8. So if you have housing projects or housing authorities that work in tandem with Section 8, a combination of the two. Section 202, supportive housing for the elderly. Section 811, supportive housing for people with disabilities. The Housing Trust Fund. Another set of programs are the Policy 236, multifamily rental housing. Policy 221, D3, D5, below market interest rate housing, or the BIMR. Home housing, home project. HOPWA, or the Housing Opportunities for People with AIDS or HIV. The McKinney-Vento homelessness programs, which is from our continuous care. It includes Emergency Solutions Grants or ESGs, and the continuum of care. Also, VAWA is umbrellaed under the Department of Agriculture, which includes Rural Development or RD multifamily, and the Department of Treasury or the IRS with Low Income Housing Tax Credit or the LIHTC. If you want more specific details on any of these housing solutions, please, at the end of this webinar, we'll show different types of resources under the Safe Housing Partnerships and also here at Safe Housing Alliance. Okay, so let's talk about some innovative models for safe housing. So, have to sip my tea because there are shifts happening. There's a necessary shift towards safe housing. So we talked about the battered housing movement. There are shifts over the past few years. What's happening? Housing models that have emerged. And resources have traditionally centered on emergency shelter and transitional housing. So short-term goals, short-term housing solutions. And shelters and transitional housing only delay housing crisis if no permanent housing options exist as an exit. So as part of the exit plan for emergency shelter and transitional housing, survivors should be equipped with the knowledge of this and help to design that. So the shift is moving towards a growing emphasis in the field on expanding and broadening the movement's focus from crisis shelter to creating access for survivors through the housing continuum. And also, ongoing research shows the immediate and lasting impacts of domestic violence and sexual violence, and the need for a survivor-focused lens when addressing housing barriers. So what are those options? So survivors need all the options, and not just emergency shelter and transitional housing, which can be scarce, like we talked about in part one. We also want to talk about establishing and addressing the crisis. So it's not a recycle with emergency housing. Things to consider as options may include shelter and safe homes. So this could be non-traditional shelter, hotel vouchers, especially during COVID. This was very paramount because hotels were vacant due to people not traveling as much. And there were a lot of hotel vouchers that were given to really occupy the space because it was available. So coming up with creative solutions like that can be ways to add more options in emergency housing. Relocation assistance. So if survivors have resources in other neighboring counties or cities, then having those options to move and assistance with that. Installing security devices in current housing. So like we discussed, all survivors don't need to stay home, don't need to move out. We discussed about 50% leave their homes and 50% stay in their homes. But so installing a security system or maybe a ring light or something, a life safety necklace or life alert type of system, that might be a solution in flexible funding. Also staying with friends and family, depending on the survivor's level of comfortability, the willingness to share, share space and share also housing with another person. There's different things to consider, like we talked about in our video from part one. Protection orders. So that might be another option for survivors, having themselves equipped with an order of protection, if that's something that they would choose to do. And also shallow subsidy or financial assistance, really seeking assistance from human resources departments and maybe perhaps cash assistance or medical assistance, healthcare, and safety planning, advocacy, and access to trauma-informed services. You're going to see a pattern of this across the board. And when we talk about advocacy, that could mean peer advocacy, survivors supporting other survivors. That can really help support their housing journey. If you see something similar to what the person has experienced, they could see, people who are further along or people who are less further along, and it becomes a community of care. Also, we want to address the barriers to staying safely housed, to retaining that housing, which could mean bridge housing. This includes facility-based scattered site transitional housing. This can also include the joint component program, so a combination of different types of housing or housing vouchers or housing subsidies that can help the whole household. Temporary rental subsidy, so really like that ERAP, the emergency rental assistance program that's been prevalent over the past couple of years, just to really help with making ends meet. Master leasing, so having different persons as heads of household. economic and employment support and advocacy. So really help with obtaining more income or maybe a second source of income, and really advocating for survivors to really apply for higher education or some type of vocational aspect that can help boost their level of earning income. Uh, some supports can also consist of mental health or addiction support, so help with sobriety or really going to certain supportive programs that can help maintain their quality of life, and rapid reading. Noticing that housing first might be the solution if it's available in your county. And those safety planning, advocacy, and access to trauma-informed services across the board. So we also want to talk about embedded safety and lasting stabilizations, permanent housing. So really trying to shift from emergency housing and transitional housing towards permanent housing. And that could mean returning to one's own housing once they feel safe. So once the abuser might be out of the picture, or things have started to stabilize, going back to their own community, their original home. Considerations that have to be implemented here. Shared housing. That could mean being having a roommate, somebody to help the survivor not feel isolated or feel alone, or really to help with the home and responsibilities and expenses that are allotted with taking care of your own home. Might mean just having a roommate for that type of sustained housing as an alternative to shelter. Self-sustaining following rapid rehousing. So what are those self-help or self-empowerment things that can help towards maintaining rapid rehousing and afterward? The housing voucher. So having more of those permanent solutions like the EHV voucher that are more sustainable than sometimes some city programs, public housing, home purchase assistance. So survivors are really moving towards owning their own homes, or owning more property, or that could even mean owning more assets or a vehicle or something like that. Really talking about going to the next level of survivorship. And also permanent supportive housing. There might need to be some case management on site that can help with any sorts of things that the survivors and their families are going through, or even counseling services on site. So permanent supportive housing, or PSH, might be more of a permanent solution. And again, safety planning, advocacy, and access to trauma-informed services. And culturally specific services too. So these are just a snapshot of options to consider as you are developing your housing programs and developing things towards engaging with survivors in your communities. Now, providing survivors with the resources to avoid homelessness is very crucial. Two things: we want to advocate for survivors' rights and housing rights. And with that, we want to help to provide housing advocacy for survivors. We also want to train landlords and other housing providers on the laws. So laws change over time. We just had the reauthorization of the VAWA Act. So we want to really inform the public about these things, and really introduce them in conversations and invite them to trainings in different places, so they're equipped with the knowledge as well, and they can help support their tenants. We also want to educate survivors about their housing rights. Many times, survivors, this is their first time experiencing homelessness, and they might not be privy to understanding their rights and therefore accepting what is given to them. And that's not always a way that we can help lift past oppression or lift past the cycle of power and control. Therefore, there's a level of control from an existing entity rather than from a person. But we've discussed that in depth in part 1. So please, please continue your knowledge on education and about rights, because it's always changing. We also want to help survivors to remain in their homes if they choose. And we shortly discussed about providing flexible funding to help survivors access safe and permanent housing. Well, that could mean like maybe help with securing a washer machine. I have, for example, there was a survivor that I was engaged with about a year and a half ago, and her situation was her abuser lived in the same neighborhood. She didn't really want to move, but she wanted to remain safe. And what she thought was a solution for herself was if she had access to a washer and dryer so she can do laundry. So she wouldn't have to go to the local laundromat to do her clothes, where her abuser could be could stalk her or gaslight her. And that flexible funding option became a reality. She was able to secure that washer and dryer in her home and remain housed rather than moving to a shelter or an unstable place, and which would cost her a great deal more down the line. And keeping herself in her home and able to do household chores, that's what made her feel safe and happy. So providing those levels of customized flexible funding is something to consider when you're developing your funding strategies and your housing programs. Offering mobile advocacy. So having people not always go to you, but meet them where they are. So going out into the community, going on the ground to really assess engagement with survivors and just awareness about what domestic violence is. That's very important. And it's not just during DVAM or Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October. It's all year round. It's engaging with different types of intersections with housing, like shelters, pantries where people are food insecure, maybe making connections there, making connections with local diaper banks, where people are just having getting pregnant or having having newborns, connecting with those communities. Those are just a couple of examples of how you can really offer that mobile advocacy, meet people where they are. And also providing financial literacy. So those strengthening goals, we talked about the credit bureaus in our part 1, but we really want to offer more sufficiency resources, that self-sufficiency. And that could mean partnering with banks or local community organizations that have these programs and offer it on a more widespread lens. Okay. So with enhancing safety, and access for survivors within the housing and homelessness systems, or H&H. We want to make sure that we're protecting survivors' information, personally identifying information, or PII. And here's are a few things that we want to discuss. When coordinating assessment and entry systems to include safety and confidentiality for survivors, we want to make sure that we have comparable databases that are really protecting survivors' information. We talked a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about HMIS. We talked about it in our definition space, but really having HMIS and a comparable database that are operating parallel to each other, not intersecting with each other. Making it safe for survivors to disclose or share their story, and considering trauma-informed assessments. So really unpacking root causes of trauma, and making it safe for the physical space where they are, where they're conducting this assessment, and having levels of privacy. So these are all things to consider for the environment in enhancing safety. We also want to help with creating access to domestic violence and sexual violence services throughout housing and homelessness systems. So we want to make those bridge connections, and not really having people lose access to housing options. We want, no matter what door survivors are going through, they are getting access to services on a equitable scale. And we also want to build trust with Black and Indigenous people of color, or BIPOC survivors, or really survivors with an anti-oppressive lens, and increasing racial equity within training and assessment tools. So all those considerations we talked at part one about equity conversations, we want to make sure that we're addressing those disproportionalities and disparities in housing, and providing more layered supports, especially within our levels of assessment. And that can help with prioritization scales. Now, with creating confidentiality for survivors in the homeless status system, we want to provide survivors with the option to opt in rather than opt out of central databases and other client systems. So opting in kind of alludes to the effort that the survivors are really informed about anything they might be signing or agreeing with their housing options. And also with a preferred language if their language is not English, and really having the communication bonds developed so people can really opt in for the service rather than feeling fearful and just trying to do whatever is necessary to move along the process, or opt out feeling really discouraged and I don't really want my information out there, and might retreating to go back towards their abuser. And also letting them know that they're whether they like to opt in for service or opt out, that would not affect their housing supportive services. You also want to create confidentiality around understanding what's victim service providers can and can't disclose and why. Sometimes it depends on your jurisdictions. Survivors, service providers can disclose or can't disclose systems involvement. So involvement with the judicial system or with the incarceration system. They may be a mandated reporter, so they might have to report acts of child abuse that they might witness. So preparing survivors to be informed about that, about the level of mandated reporting, child welfare, law enforcement, etc. And there's also a level of historical distrust in the system. It's basically based on past experiences and generational trauma. As you know, there are many community violence happening in our neighborhoods today, and that can help create impressions against survivors and their willingness to become open and share their story to help them and their family. So we want to help with really developing comparable databases for survivors to protect their individuality and ensure that their information is staying safe and not going to other providers or other landlords or anyone that they don't allow that for. And that's also under our VAWA protections. And then also we're talking about enhancing partnerships between domestic violence and sexual assault or sexual violence and homeless and housing response systems. And we want to make accessible, like we talked about, having access to care no matter what door the survivor is walking into, making accessible the full range of housing resources and tools within the homelessness and housing system to the domestic violence and sexual violence system. So we talked about all those models of care, the emergency shelter and the transitional housing. Moving along towards permanent housing, we want to have survivors access to all of those levels of housing. And with domestic violence and sexual violence and homeless and housing providers partnering on wraparound services. We don't have all the solutions to everything. It's important that we partner together to really help the village. The village helps the one. And ongoing cross-training between domestic violence and sexual violence and homeless and housing providers. There are things that expertise that is in one field that might not be in the next. So we have to continuously meet with each other and make that a part of our workflow, not just make that a part of something nice to do. It's something that is a part of our work ethics and our vision and mission in whatever types of housing or supportive services we are providing. And I know you guys are great folks, and you guys are really working on these things on a daily basis. I want to give kudos to everyone who is on this call, because the amazing work that you do with your communities, within your staff, and within your own personal lives. Thank you for all that you do, and we're here to support you to continue doing it. And with that, we have been really working on our crisis tool, and that's really breaking down some of the vulnerabilities that survivors may have when they're accessing housing. And we want to make sure that we're addressing many levels of vulnerability, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. So our crisis tool is really having it has a few goals, but here's our two top goals for right now. We're still in the developmental phase. Goal number 1 is to identify which questions, as we're taking imagine you're in the assessment, and imagine you're delivering assessment to a survivor, or even imagine yourself on the opposite side of the table receiving the assessment. So goal number 1 is to identify which questions you would be asking would be most useful for our cross-system crisis tool, where prioritization processes should include beneficial partnerships and integrations and analyzing systems gaps. So what are the questions that is really going to hone down housing solutions rather than gauge gauge more information that's not really required or necessary? And what are the partnerships that need to be developed in order to have those questions maximized? So goal number 2, um, really we want to talk about having a limited amount of questions. So in order to having the right questions, we want to limit them as well, making a shorter assessment and promoting trauma-informed approaches across agencies. Therefore, co-collaboration and co-designing is key. Like we just mentioned earlier, we don't have all the solutions alone. We might look to different of expertise elsewhere and within our own skill sets. And we want to help to co-design a space that can really help the future line of survivors that are coming into our doors. And of course, those questions can come in a level of categories. We've narrowed down to a few overarching categories for our crisis tool within the DV expansion work group here in the 3-county continuum of care. And here are what we've narrowed it down to, which we have been discussing in depth. First, we talked about safety planning. So are you safe? Of those questions, is it comfortable for you to speak right now? And then also are you eligible age? Are there other supports that might be needed immediately? Alternatives to shelter, so that could be going to friends or family that could help support, or questions around there. Also, we want to center survivor autonomy or survivor agency and choice when it comes to their housing options. Questions around that, around where they want to choose to live, and also addressing risk of harm and access to firearms. So addressing if there's any suicide threats, or if there are any guns or illegal equipment in the household, access to firearms. We want to make sure that survivors are safe. This is part of the danger assessment. We also want to unpack source of income. So that might mean addressing where those income resources are coming from. We talked earlier about Social Security income or TANF, and potential economic barriers. So we're talking about that credit history, or a bankruptcy that could have been filed. These are all questions that we want to consider when really trying to prioritize the best housing solution. And environmental factors. This can include where they were living, if it was a safe condition where they were, and household dynamics. So who's in the household? Are there children? Are there elderly? Is this a single housing unit? And then lastly, our last category is on healthcare and supportive services. We'll talk a little bit about that more in our mental health section. Leading us to mental health. And these are really supports that have become really paramount within the past couple of years, in having mental health supports on site, or really demystifying the stigmas around mental health. So here's part of its framework. Poverty, unemployment, and lack of affordable housing are commonly recognized as causes of homelessness. These risk factors can be exacerbated by personal vulnerabilities, such as mental and substance abuse disorders, trauma and violence, domestic violence, justice system involvement, sudden serious illness, divorce, death of a partner, and disabilities. Now, adding permanent supportive housing on a housing first basis, DV housing first, without requiring transitional steps, is effective for people experiencing chronic homelessness. Also effective for domestic violence survivors. Housing first principles. Housing first, and then think about the supportive services needed, like mental health. More awareness, survivor-centered services, and research and policies are needed to transform mental health care systems to properly support survivors of intimate partner violence, or IPV. Okay. If you'd like to hear a little bit more about mental health, SAMHSA, or the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Supportive Services national organization, really has a plethora of information. So I encourage anyone to visit their website as SAMHSA, I believe. Now, coping with traumatic events. Everyone has a series of mental health that they are that can be addressed, and that includes survivors. And now we'll have to work out levels of coping. So traumatic events can include experiences such as natural disasters, which include hurricanes, earthquakes, and floods, acts of violence, such as an assault, abuse, terror attacks, and mass shootings, and car crashes or other accidents. All of these things are traumatic events, and we have to assert some level of coping after the storm, and really want to live past a fear-based model. And fear is a part of the body's fight or flight response, which helps us avoid or respond to potential danger. So this is really tapping into the well-known statistic that survivors experience abuse about 7 times before they actually seek support. Because it could be that whole it could be the flight, or being submissive, or allowing it to happen, or expecting the abuser to change. These are all levels of fear or fear-based mentality. We want to help really encourage that there are different methods to respond to fear, and fear is okay, it's normal. And really, how can we talk about it more openly as a preventative model rather than a reactive model with the whole fight or flight response. Continued, we want to talk about healthy ways for those preventative aspects to be integrated into our lives, into our everyday lives. And coping can really help reduce the stress and improve well-being. So, of course, traumatic events are stressful. How are we going to go about improving our well-being after the event? So here are some things you can encourage on an ongoing basis with your communities that you serve. You want to try to maintain routines, and this is a very small list. The list could be, many things, but here are just a few. Spending time with trusted friends and relatives who are supportive to survivor needs. So having a level of, really intermittent support, identifying who's in your pod. You can look towards the Bay Area Transformative Justice, really principles on pod mapping here. Try to maintain routines for meals, exercise, and sleep. So having your mind really, in a state of routine can help with fighting mental health, hosting engagement in sites and virtually on exercising, mindfulness, or other activities that help reduce stress. And that can really, meditation can really help with just stabilizing balance in life. Um, I really like this resource on calm scenes. I take some time, like a little bit or out of the course of my day, which we're going to do in just a moment, to really reflect and just level set on things that are happening, stressful events that happen on a day-to-day basis. Calm scenes is something that you can use your device. You can use a phone or your computer to really access. And this is some of the things, some of the engagements or interactivities in here are at cost, but some are free, which is calm scenes. And you can choose from, you see, there's many scenes here that you can tap into and just take a moment of reflection in your day. I invite everyone to really have a moment of reflection right now as we are in this training. I invite everyone to put your feet flat on the floor, and we're just going to help with a breathing exercise. One deep breath in and out. And this time we're going to breathe in, but we're going to exhale with a sound. So moments like these can be tapped into at any point in your day and with your communities when accessing services and support, and really can help attribute to sustaining mental health. And this also includes setting realistic goals and focusing on what you can manage. So one step at a time, day by day, can really help towards designing a housing journey that can really help sustain housing. So we have to be equipped with SMART goals and realistic goals based on, moments in time. Now, let's work together to improve mental health care access for all, not just domestic violence survivors, any type of people that you're communicating with, the local super, the local person in the bodega, and just taking a look at all these different types of people engaging with each other, and let's band together to really support a movement towards more mental health and more options for well-being and healthier relationships. All right, so we're going to come to a close, and I wanted to talk about resources. Safe Housing Alliance is a part of the Safe Housing Partnership. And here are a listing of our partners in the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium, or the DVH-TAC. Our federal partners include FIPSA, or the Family Violence Prevention and Services Program, with HHS, or Health and Human Services. Also, our partners include OVW, or the Office on Violence Against Women, or the Department, and also with the Department of Justice, the United States Department of Justice. We're also with OVC, or the Office of Victims of Crime, with the Department of Justice. Our federal partners include the Office of Special Needs Assistant Programs, or HUD SNAPS, and the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is USAGE. Our technical assistance providers that we are partnered with include Collaborative Solutions, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence, or the NAESB, the National Network to End Domestic Violence, or NNEDV, the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, which is NRCDV, the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, or NSVRC, of course, ourselves, the Safe Housing Alliance, formerly known as NASH, and STARS, the Indigenous Safe Housing Center, or with the the National Indigenous Safe Housing Center, or NIWRC. A quick glance at our website, safehousingta.org. Here you could find our mission and vision, and different programs, our concepts that we hold, the safe housing approach. If you have time, please review those different things that we talked about during our DV 101 training. It goes into depth a little bit more on our website. So please take a look when you have a chance, learning a little bit more about us. And with the Safe Housing Partnerships, our technical assistance providers together have correlated over the past couple of years, different resources, which includes the video that we talked about in part 1. And here there's a search option for really highlighting if you're looking for a specific topic, like comparable databases 101. And there's also one-pagers on information or webinars that we have hosted in the past. Please feel free to browse our Safe Housing Partnerships website. It's a plethora of knowledge that can really help towards different cities and states. And contact us. Our email is safehousingta.org. You can follow us online on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at safehousingta, and also send us an email at info@safehousingta.org. This completes the conclusion of our DV and Housing 101 training. Again, my name is Charlena Powell. I'm with the Safe Housing Alliance, and thank you so much in participating in part 1 and part 2 of our trainings. And please feel free to keep in touch. If you have any questions, please feel free to give us a call or give us a message. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and let's stay in touch. Bye for now.